It was a late October evening when I decided to take a shortcut through the rural outskirts of our small town. The night had fallen quickly, as it often does in autumn, and with it came a dense, unexpected fog. I'd traveled this road countless times before, but tonight it felt alien, like a scene from a movie where the ordinary twists into the sinister. The fog was so thick, I could barely see a few feet in front of my car. Every turn and landmark seemed unfamiliar, and soon I realized I was lost. My heart raced a bit at the thought, but I tried to stay calm, reducing my speed and squinting through the windshield, hoping for something recognizable. That's when I first heard it, a faint rustling sound, like someone moving through the underbrush. I dismissed it as a deer or some other animal. It's not uncommon in these parts. But as I continued, the noise seemed to follow, growing closer, more pronounced. I kept telling myself it was just the wind. Turning down what I hoped was the right road, I came upon an old, seemingly abandoned car. It was parked haphazardly on the side of the road, its doors slightly ajar. The fog lent it an eerie quality, like a relic from a forgotten time. Curiosity overcame me, and despite my better judgment, I stopped to investigate. I approached the car slowly, my footsteps muffled by the damp earth. Peering inside, I saw nothing but old wrappers and a musty, torn-up seat. I wondered if someone had broken down and gone for help, but something about it felt off. The air was heavy, still, as if the fog itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it again, the rustling, now accompanied by soft whispers that seemed to swirl around me. Panic rose in my throat. I spun around, scanning the fog, but saw only shifting shadows. That's when I decided to head back to my car. As I walked back, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of a figure in the fog, just at the edge of my vision. Whenever I stopped, it stopped, and when I moved, it moved. My heart was pounding now, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Once inside my car, I locked the doors and tried to start the engine, but it sputtered and died. I was stranded, in the middle of nowhere, with a phone that had conveniently run out of battery. I felt a surge of fear and frustration. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to decide what to do. The whispers continued, closer now, and I could almost make out words, but not quite. It was as if someone was having a conversation just beyond my hearing. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a loud banging noise from behind. I jumped, my heart racing. I turned to look back but saw nothing in the thick fog. I tried the engine again, desperately willing it to start. Finally, after several agonizing attempts, the car roared to life. I didn't hesitate, putting it into gear and driving as fast as I dared through the fog. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, but eventually, I saw the familiar lights of the town. I didn't stop until I reached my house. Once inside, I locked the doors and windows, my hands still shaking. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a trick of the mind, the fog playing games. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something unexplainable. The next day, I returned to the spot where I'd seen the abandoned car, but it was gone. There was no sign that it, or the strange occurrences of the night before, had ever been there. I asked around, but nobody knew anything about a car being abandoned in that area. The incident left me with many questions and a deep sense of unease. Every time a fog rolls in now, I can't help but remember that night, the whispers, and the shadows. I wonder if I had imagined it all, or if something had really been out there, in the fog with me. I still take that road sometimes, but never at night, and never when the fog descends. There are things in this world we can't explain, and sometimes, it's better not to try. It was a typical weekday morning, but the dense fog outside was anything but typical. As a security guard at an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, I was used to quiet, uneventful shifts. The warehouse, mostly abandoned, stored old furniture and dusty, forgotten boxes. It was a place that hardly anyone visited, a silent giant in the middle of nowhere. That morning, as I made my way to the warehouse, the fog was so thick I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I remember thinking how the world seemed to have disappeared behind a veil of white. I arrived at the warehouse just as the day was struggling to break, the fog turning the sunrise into a mere suggestion of light. The first few hours of my shift passed in the usual monotony. I did my rounds, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the fog inside the building, which seemed to seep through every crack and crevice. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound being my footsteps echoing off the walls. As I walked through the rows of shelves, I noticed something odd. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound, like someone gently knocking on wood. I stopped, trying to pinpoint the source, but it stopped as abruptly as it had started. Shaking it off as my imagination, I continued my patrol. But then, there it was again. The tapping, clearer this time, coming from the far end of the warehouse. My heart started to race. No one was supposed to be here. I cautiously made my way towards the sound, my hand gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. As I neared the source, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from behind a large, old armoire. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But my duty as a security guard propelled me forward. With a deep breath, I moved the armoire aside. Behind it, I found an old, battered door I had never noticed before. The tapping was coming from the other side. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. The moment I touched it, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I opened the door slowly, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Behind the door was a small, hidden room, filled with old files and documents. And there, on the floor, was the source of the tapping, a small, metal pipe, vibrating against the concrete. Relief washed over me. It was just the building settling, I thought. But as I turned to leave, a cold breeze brushed against my neck, and I heard it, a whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. It sounded like someone saying my name. I spun around, flashlight scanning the room, but there was nobody there. Just me, the old files, and the creeping fog that had somehow found its way inside. I left the room quickly, closing the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of whispers just beyond the edge of hearing. When my shift ended, I left the warehouse feeling relieved but unsettled. The fog outside had lifted, but the fog in my mind remained. I never found out the source of the whispers, and I never went back to that hidden room. But sometimes, on foggy days, I can still hear that faint tapping, and a whisper, calling my name. In our quiet suburban neighborhood, a dense fog was a rarity, especially one as thick as what descended that winter evening. I had just finished dinner and was feeling a bit restless. Deciding a walk might clear my head, I stepped out into the chilly air, the streetlights barely making a dent in the thick white blanket that enveloped everything. The fog felt almost tangible, muffling sounds and distorting shapes. I walked slowly, my footsteps the only noise breaking the eerie silence. I've always found solace in solitude, but tonight, the isolation felt different, more oppressive. As I strolled down the familiar streets, I noticed something odd, a faint silhouette in the distance, seemingly following me. Every time I stopped, it stopped, and when I resumed walking, it seemed to do the same. My rational mind told me it was probably just another late-night walker, but something about the figure's movements felt off. Trying to shake off the unease, I continued my walk, but the feeling of being followed persisted. The fog seemed to grow thicker, the streetlights now just faint halos in the distance. That's when I heard it, a faint whispering sound, barely audible over my own breathing. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from or what was being said. Deciding it was time to head back, I quickened my pace. My heart started to beat faster, not just from the brisk walk, but also from a growing sense of dread. I rounded a corner and nearly collided with another person. We both startled, and he apologized, explaining he was just as disoriented by the fog. His presence was somewhat comforting, but the encounter left me even more on edge. As I made my way back home, the whispering sound continued, now accompanied by a feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was only the empty, foggy street. The streetlights seemed dimmer now, their light struggling to penetrate the fog. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a loud noise behind me. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. I spun around, heart racing, but the fog obscured everything. I considered investigating the sound but decided against it. I needed to get home. Finally, I saw my house emerge from the fog, a beacon of safety. I hurried inside and locked the door, peering out through the window. The street was empty, the fog a shifting curtain that hid any potential threats. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that the fog had just played tricks on my mind. The next morning, I ventured out to see if I could find the source of the loud noise from the previous night. The fog had lifted, revealing a clear, bright day. Walking back to where I had heard the sound, I discovered that a large tree branch had fallen onto the sidewalk. The mystery solved, I felt a bit foolish for letting my imagination run wild. But the experience stayed with me. Whenever I walked in the evening after that, I couldn't help but feel a bit of trepidation, especially when the fog rolled in. I never saw the silhouette again, nor did I hear the whispering, but the memory of that foggy evening walk lingered. It was a reminder that even the most familiar places could feel alien and threatening under the right conditions. The fog had transformed my peaceful neighborhood into a landscape where every shadow and sound seemed to hold a hint of danger. While I knew it was probably all in my head, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was more to that night than just fog and shadows.